I've literally recorded this 3 times because one time I didn't have the camera hooked up or the audio hooked up, and another time I had dogs barking and so Dad's having challenges. So far, this book has defined meaning 1.0 as that which was derived from the divine, and meaning 2.0, or derived from democratic free markets, or from the self, being able to pull yourself up, divine your own meaning, pull up your own bootstraps and all that stuff. And importantly, described how that failed. In the first chapter, he went on to talk about how our Cinderella story is the seed of humanity and how we got into our current state, where he highlighted how horrible things are. Now, in my opinion, it appears that all the horrible things he described are more the result of neoliberalism and selfishness. When the pursuit of the individual wealth surpassed the pursuit of salvation or the betterment of society, then the planet and the majority of the population suffered. As an aside, I think there's a glaring omission in our history. Humans, with our bodies and brains, have existed for 300,000 years, and we've only glancing information. This is 100 to 200,000 years, but the oldest known human remains are 300,000 years ago. So we only have glancing information about the last 10,000 years or so. So that means that 290,000 years, we literally know nothing about humanity other than a few skeletons, fire pits, and rock tool here and there. I listened to a book not too long ago that suggested that there have been other civilizations in that time and have left no trace. I looked up some stats on garbage with the exception of I looked up some stats on garbage, and with the exception of glass and polystyrene and a few other minor things, everything we use decomposes in about 1 or 2,000 years. So that means if our civilization disappeared today, in a couple thousand years there would be almost no trace, and in 50,000 years even less so. This includes skyscrapers, which would degrade. In the British History podcast, the host talks about the Roman era and how the residents of Great Britain, just a couple hundred years after the Romans left, knew nothing of them. We know from written accounts and from archaeology that there were several cities in Britain that were mass production sites for goods shipped all over the empire, and most of them were literal farmland by the 8th century. I remember I watched the show where they found this initially on Time Team, and it literally was just farmland, and they found the pieces, and over time they were able to build up what you see there. Anyway, I'm digressing. In the second chapter of the book is called "Stop Making Sense," and it begins by defining a few words, some of which you've heard before, and others you probably haven't. Eschaton is a Greek term meaning the divine plan for the end of the world. Just to prove that I'm saying it right.
Eschaton.
Apocalypse means unveiling or revealing. So think voila in French, or tada. I imagine some ancient Greek magician on a street corner shouting apocalypse. Now, Armageddon is a Latinization of a contraction in Hebrew, Har-Megiddo. I mapped it out here so you could see Jerusalem and Megiddo. So literally, this is a mountain, or a hill, really. It's close to the West Bank, and prophecy says that the final war between good and evil will happen in this place. By the way, this is somewhat unrelated, but the meaning of the word Israel is struggles with God. And in biblical time, there was 2 countries, Israel and Judea. This was in the first temple period. So there was Israel and Judea. Israel was the northern part, and that's where the lost tribes of Israel were. And basically, reportedly, they stopped living by the covenant. They stopped following the covenant with God, so he allowed them to be wiped off the planet by the Assyrian Empire a century or so before the Jews were taken into Babylon, ending that first temple period. And also, based on a not so complimentary documentary about the founding of Israel, I think they may have chosen the right name. It was, again, not very complimentary. Now, rapture has two meanings. It sort of depends on the capitalization. So rapture with a small r means intense bliss or pleasure. If it's got a big R, then that means it's specifically talking about a story in the Bible in which the select are taken to heaven. I think ultimately humans need to have stories that define the beginning and the ending because it matches the flow of life as we experience. We wake up, we go to sleep every day. We see birth, we experience death. I don't know that I personally subscribe to all of that. Instead of beginnings and endings, I see changes. I know I've said this aloud before, but if the worst happens, humans would continue to exist. They would adapt and exist on the planet, and the planet will heal itself after we're not actively hurting it anyway. So the first subsection is a knee-jerk reaction, where he starts by retelling the story that defines the Semmelweis reflex, the idea that we habitually reject new evidence or new knowledge to our own detriment. Semmelweis was the doctor that realized it was better to wash your hands between patients to cut down on infection, but his colleagues thought he was crazy. This could also be called cognitive bias. We believe what we believe because we believe it, and even more so if we surround ourselves with others, we have a hard time of taking in new information. The next little section he called Mad Max Libs. He could have also called it attempting to predict. In this section, he goes into how unusual things are now. Post-World War II, we in the West have lived in a very strange bubble. I mentioned in the last video about how your great-grandmother, my grandmother, lived for a short time in a sod house. Your grandmother, my mother, was born and spent maybe the first 5 or 6 years of her life in a house with a dirt floor. In this country, in the last century, everything you take for granted was discovered or made available. Only three generations in the West have known electricity, reliable water, air conditioning. We in the U.S. have not been host to a war since the Civil War over 150 years ago. Wheel shares several examples of once-in-a-lifetime occurrences in the natural world, like fires and floods and storms, and how almost impossible it is to predict them, or how we can get out of them. Essentially, Wheel is saying that it's hard to predict the future based on the past, because our recent past has been an anomaly, unpredictable. Winston Churchill said, "Plans are useless, but planning is invaluable." And our predictions are often hampered by a Semmelweis reflex, a knee-jerk reaction to cognitive bias. So, again, just to highlight, planning is important, and acknowledging history and the patterns that we've taken in the past are also important. Because every one of those things, every one of those occurrences, the fall of the Roman Empire, the fall of the British Empire, every one of those things are indicative of human actions to certain things, to certain inputs. But it's almost impossible for us to look, based on history, Trump isn't Hitler. Now, we can look at how Hitler became, rose to fortune and identify what those are, but just knowing that's not going to stop somebody else from doing it, because they'll take a very slightly different path. But we can look at it, especially in hindsight, and we can see how those things are similar. The next section is called Barbecue Your Sacred Cows. I thought this was particularly a funny combination of images. Will says that there are three drivers affecting our ability to mold the future: cognitive complexity, sacred cows, and the ability to grieve. If we manage these three issues, we can meet the challenges of the future. Cognitive or mental complexity. I have whined openly about the loss of what Wheel calls benign authority. I think I've used the term the fairness doctrine, which was something in broadcasting that existed until the 80s. There was a time when you could watch the news and really believe that that was news. Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw, Walter Cronkite were all trusted news people who reported facts. Barbara Walters would probably put in there too. Dan Rather famously was misled and reported some untruths about Bush #2, and he lost his career of it, something which today he might have received a reward for. He did get a movie. It's easy to suggest that this is only a problem on the Fox or conservative side. It isn't. The left is as full of misinformation and confusion. We have to use critical thinking to validate what we are told and not just accept information as real, no matter where it comes from. We have to sacrifice our sacred cows. So sacred cows is an interesting term. It relates to the Hindu religion, which is not really part of our life experience. And it was a derisive term originally. The British were making fun of their Hindu subjects. But the phrase is easy enough to understand. We all have something that is sacred to us, culturally or individually. The examples in this book are focused on religions, government systems, and commerce systems mostly. Wheel relates how many in the West felt vindicated by the fall of the Soviet Union because it seemed to suggest that we in the West won, that our system of government and commerce were superior. But the last 30 years is not bearing that out. Gave other examples, including the Arab Spring, where many in the West thought that the people were rebelling in the streets and that they wanted to establish a neoliberal society. But they were surprised when instead of neoliberal democracies, they had fundamental theocracies instead. We want to think that a free market requires democracy, but China proves that not to be the case. So even though it's comfortable in some ways, the government we are used to, the form of commerce we are used to, the language we speak, and all the comforts we're used to may all be sacred cows, and we may have to be prepared to toss them all out. If we put our collective sacred cows on the proverbial barbecue, we may need to let them go. And that is, if we cannot sacrifice, then sit back and grumble that we do not have them anymore. Denial is not helpful. If a thing or concept is lost, we can still look forward to a bright Star Trek-y future. That may look very different than what we imagine with our sacred cows. Son and I once talked about how Star Trek universe happened, and in that imaginary universe, the path was bumpy and ugly, even if it was not super clear. So the bottom line is grieve losses. But let's yes and this motherfucker. The chapter continues with identity politics and the infinite game by discussing culture wars. Just as discussed in the first chapter about how the reasonable middle are not supported by substantive meaning and how many either find fundamentalism or nihilism for some foundation. Will talks about the culture wars left and right in political terms. But why is that? Why is it when we are in such trouble, we are more willing to point fingers and yell across the aisle instead of holding each other up? Well, Will suggests that it has to do with our biochemistry. He reports that from a series of studies that boil down to when people experience sustained chronic stress due to loss of social status, economic hardships, or dislocation, their serotonin levels drop, causing depression. And then they are more likely to behave vengefully. In addition, evolutionary biologists suggest that there are two ways that cooperation evolves. One is genetic relatedness, and the other is based on reciprocity. So, the latter, reciprocity, is the I scratch your back if you'll scratch mine deal. And the other is, well, racist. Cooperation based on reciprocity is a lot more fragile as well. And we, and other primates, will revert to the other in stressful times. So a good example of that is, imagine a Thunder game, downtown Oklahoma City. Before the game, everybody's hyped, everyone's ready to go. Black, white, Asian, Indian, doesn't matter. Everybody's on the same team. They all want the Thunder to win. A couple of beers and a loss, and when those people are leaving the convention center or wherever it is they play those stupid games, inevitably someone uses the N-word. Inevitably there's a fight that breaks out. And part of that is the alcohol, and part of it is the fact that the reciprocity is gone. The win is not there. So biology and serotonin depletion is part of the picture, but let's throw in a dash of dopamine. So when we surround ourselves with others who support our cognitive bias, or people with the same opinions, we get a rush of dopamine. This could be in person at a political rally or a protest, or spending a lot of time on virtual versions of either. So we feel better with the rush of dopamine. But coupled with that chronic stress, we end up behaving worse. Another chemical, oxytocin, is described often as the cuddle hormone. You feel that one when you're cuddling a family member or a pet. And that's all good. But additional studies show that when you feel oxytocin rushes under stress, it generally increases gloating about your group. It elevates otherisms. That is to say that we are tribal animals. I suppose that ultimately the easier way to say the last few dozen sentences is our brains are designed to provide good-feeling hormones when we are in our tribe. And at the same time, these hormones encourage us to distrust that other tribe. I'm sure we can all think of just a handful of examples of how that can play out. Will said, left to our own devices, we regress under stress to tribalism. Tribalism is destiny. Humanism is optional. And it's a lot easier to see how we could end up in Mad Max movie world than the Star Trek movie world. The last section in this chapter is called The Dark Odds. No. The last section in this chapter is called The Dark Artists. And I have to be honest, sometimes this book is hard. So this section is basically how we intentionally and unintentionally use what we know intuitively for our own ends. Fragility is exploitable. A study from QIT in Australia proved that more than simple tribalism, there is a psychological component as well. They studied American residents who were divided into three categories: radical left, progressive liberal, big L liberal, and the book says this, white identity. And based on the rest of the chapter, I'm assuming that they mean white nationalists. The study was to look at how these groups view authoritarianism by measuring what the psychiatrists called the dark triad of personality types: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. The progressive liberal, that is the big L, we might say centrists. Those are people who held general pro-social values but respected the choices of others. That group did not exhibit any of the dark triad personality types, but the far left and the far right did. Now, I don't think that's particularly a surprise. Basically, the authors of the study said they were surprised to discover that the far left and the far right had remarkably similar psychological orientation. It's not hard to go back to history books to see why, and to see how it works out. Now, the book avoids taking Hitler and Stalin as poster boys of the right and left extremes, but rather points to Robespierre, the leader of the French Revolution, who warped the ideals of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, and fraternité, into the reign of terror, chopping off something close to 300 heads. It's cathartic to not only feel right, but righteous. And it's easy to turn righteousness into despotism. Yes-anding is hard. Will writes, both extremes fantasize about burning down the whole house so we can have a clean slate on which to build a utopia. But that's naive and dangerous. When Rome fell in the 5th century, it took until the Enlightenment of the 18th century for even 1% of the West population to have a similar standard of living of the Roman middle class. Again, we're talking about a Western point of view and not really touching on the fact that the culture of Rome remained through Constantinople until about the 15th century. Over the next couple of pages, the book goes on to discussing win-lose gamemanship. The idea that to win, the other must lose. Will mentions a book from the 1980s that I might like to read called Finite and Infinite Games, a vision of life as play and possibility. The idea of that book is all around tweaking of a game mechanics to make it play infinitely. Think about playing games with a kid or a new player. And as an experienced player, you might tweak the rules a little bit to keep the other player in the game a little bit longer, like loaning somebody money in Monopoly, or putting the bumper on Mario Kart for your dad. If the game is fun and it benefits everyone, then it's good, but some players are just assholes who play to annihilate. The intention of discussing this, I think, is to talk about or provide a framework around ideals. The neoliberal game is a win-lose game, where, let's say, Scandinavian socialism is not exactly zero-sum, but it's closer to infinite. I would also argue that big L liberalism, the liberty, equality, brotherhood, sisterhood, is more win-win as presented initially, or at least it can be if the game is made to be more infinite. It occurs to me a few years ago I gave you copies of Machiavelli, not to say that this is the way, but to provide you with a blueprint that the assholes who play to win use, whether they realize it or not. I picked this book to share this way because it seems to acknowledge the shit part of the neoliberal game and hopefully provides another path. We know the assholes play to win and even cheat to win. Earlier in this chapter, we talked about why our simple monkey brains do this. Serotonin depletion from stress, dopamine rushes from being in the echo chamber, combined with narcissism and the dark triad of personality types, makes for some formidable bad guys. This isn't the end, it's just our boss level. At the end of the 18th century, big L liberals came in the form of Enlightenment thinkers that had boss level to beat as well. In America, it was the founding fathers deposing the empire of the United Kingdom. And in France, it was the autocratic monarchy against the people. Now, how those folks won the initial battles was the acknowledgement of either collective destruction or salvation. Benjamin Franklin said on the floor of the Second Continental Congress on the day the Declaration of Independence was signed, "Gentlemen, I understand your concerns about signing this declaration. But one thing I know, we must all hang together, or most assuredly we shall hang separately." To quote Muhammad and, weirdly, George W. Bush, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." In this chapter, we began to define the enemy, both internal and external. We must be willing to, again, yes and this motherfucker, and choose our battles and combatants. Not everyone on our side is going to be woke. Nor do they need to be. We need to be able to accept that. I've read the next chapter. I've written the thing for it. After I get this one edited, I'll do that one so I can start reading this again. I love you all. Bye.